Bonjour, bonjour, and welcome to this evening's webinar where we're going to be focusing on all things hormone, how genetics impact it, and how some clinical or medical decisions might be impacting it as well. My name is Dr. Krista Koshman. I have the privilege of leading this up tonight. I'm the Chief Science Officer here at the DNA Company, and joining me this evening is the most illustrious and infamous Dr. Betty Murray, friend of the company. Hello, Betty. Welcome
Oh,
back.
thank you for having me.
Yeah. Now, for the audience who is picking up on some of the elation here, Betty and I had the privilege and pleasure of spending 3 days last week together, where we did something that at the DNA Company we're calling the She Summit, and so I'm absolutely elated that I get to jump back into conversations of hormone with Betty again. So, welcome. How are you doing, Madel?
I'm wonderful. Thank you. I'm excited to be
Yeah.
here. I was happy I could do it.
So for our audience, just as a heads up, this webinar that we're doing is happily tucked in between two different things. So we just had the She Summit where we did focus on osteoporosis, and some of that conversation, a lot of that conversation, was dealing with hormone. And we're also coming up against the He Summit. This is going to be taking place, I believe, starting March 19, and it's hosted by our co-founder Kashif Khan, and it's focusing on ED or erectile dysfunction. And so this evening, this is a little bit of a bridge insofar as we're going to be talking both sides of the aisle, men and women. We're talking all things hormone. So, where I'd like to start this evening is I want us to start talking about genetics and what genetics can tell us. And as we're doing that, please, please, please fill out the survey that we opened with. That's going to tell us who you are, man, woman, non-binary. It's going to tell us how old you are, and that really then educates us as to how we are going to be speaking to you, what we can infuse within our time together so that it's serving you. So as Betty and I dive into the glory of genes, please do fill out that survey for us, and also just let us know where you're calling in from. I always enjoy. I think the furthest we've gotten is New Zealand, Australia. I love, love, love. I'm really hoping I want someone from Africa. I want someone from South Africa or South America, sorry. That's the hope. I think we've gotten Asia before as well, but relatively speaking, Australia is just a little bit further away. Yeah. And where are you calling in tonight from, Betty? Where are you?
I'm in
Texas?
Dallas. Yeah, I'm in.
Lovely. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and we got some Canadians on here. All right. So why don't we start off and dive into the genetics that found, or at least give us a baseline of where people might be coming from a hormone perspective, right?
Sure.
Yeah. How do you want to start? Perhaps, I guess I offer at least the DNA company approach to it, and then maybe do you want to flesh that out a little bit? Yeah.
We'll do that, and we'll talk a little bit about how our environment plays into that and
Mhm.
how it starts to express itself.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So within the DNA 360, one section of the report that you're going to see is something called hormones, right? And we focus on sex steroid hormones. Sex steroid hormones roughly fall into two categories. You're going to get your androgens, which most people call testosterones. Okay. You're also going to get your estrogens, right? And so typically, a lot of the way pop science has positioned these hormones is that estrogen is all things women and testosterone is all things men. And Betty, you and I both know that that's not the case, that testosterone is very important for us ladies, gives us libido and energy amongst other things. And then we think of estrogen, very, very, very important for men, insofar as it supports a lot of cardiovascular bone function. And hold me honest here, the penis has a lot of estrogen receptors too, right? Like estrogen plays into all things sex for men as well. It's not just something
Yeah,
for
it's not just
cardiovascular.
testosterone.
Yeah.
And I actually have a really interesting statistic today that I read. I was like, God, I should have went back and looked at it. But a man, an older man, age adjusted,
Mhm.
compared to a menopausal woman, has more estradiol than a menopausal woman.
Yeah.
There's a study like the average man has 30 and a
Yeah.
menopausal woman is under 10.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't know the numbers, but I
Yeah,
knew.
I was happy to find the numbers. I was like, now I got some
Yeah.
numbers.
Yes, yes. And I think I'm grateful that you brought some of those numbers up because I think it's important for people to hear that sometimes I'm going to explain what different hormone profiles are from a genetic perspective, but sometimes I'll go to a male, like, you have an estrogen dominant profile, and they get very offended insofar as, are you calling me a woman? And first of all, I think it's a compliment to be called a woman, but separate to that, no, it's just a statement of this is how your hormone flows within your body, right? And
Oh,
we both, men and women, both have both. Yeah. So
exactly.
from a genetic perspective, right? Let's talk about these profiles. So what we are looking at, we're trying to answer three different questions when we're looking at someone's genes as to what genes curate what hormones they have. So the first question we're asking really is, how much hormone do you make? What do I mean by that? So when you come of age, when you hit puberty, some people are going to be making enough hormone to have puberty, enough hormone to have sex defining characteristics, right? Um, Whereas other people are going to have even more than enough, meaning they have enough to have all those sex characteristics to have puberty, but they have some left over. And that leftover is kind of going to be offering very exaggerated sex features, right? So in a woman, maybe a little bit more curvy and rotund, or in a man, maybe a little bit more capable of putting on muscle mass, right? It depends on the hormone to a certain extent. So that's the first question that a DNA profile can answer, right? Are you inclined to be creating just enough, or are you someone that's going over and above? The next question that we speak to within these profiles is going to be, what type of hormone do you make? Right. So across different stages for both men and women within your life, you're going to be making different amount of hormone, right? You have different needs throughout your life. By and large, though, women are going to be making a bit more estrogen than testosterone, and by and large, men are going to be making more testosterone than estrogen, right? But relative to that, some women are going to be making more androgen compared to what you'd expect in a female. And just like in some men, they're going to be making more estrogen. Does that mean they've flipped over and that's creating, opposite sex features? Absolutely not. It's all relative, right? So your DNA profile will really speak to that. And I think, Betty, this for me is very interesting because this speaks to a lot of different phenotypic characteristics that you'll see within men and women, right? So when you look at women, there's
Mhm.
that spectrum of some women are beautifully curvy, whereas other women are a little bit more lean and muscular, right? And that's kind of where this question of what type of hormone are you
Right.
making comes into play. Do you want to speak a little bit to that?
Absolutely. I think that's so important. It's one of the reasons why, when I'm looking at, our clinical patients in our office or the clinical patients that we see across our telemedicine company,
Yeah.
that idea that we can sort of blanket statement everybody gets the same dose, like it's just hormones, so we just give out hormones. And if you were to line up 50 women or 50 men for that matter,
Yeah.
we look very, very different. I'll give a really good example.
Yes.
I kind of exploded both directions when I went into puberty. I went from being this kind of gangly kid, small
Hmm.
for my height. I didn't get taller, never grew out of my clothes, but I went from like flat chested to a B cup in a summer, and my butt came
Hmm.
out the backside at the same time. And I was like, as a little kid, you're like, what just
Baby got some back.
Oh, and it's still there. Even as a bodybuilder, I was like, isn't this supposed to lean out a little bit? Now
Yeah.
J Lo is really popular. I'm like, thank God. But so I have a very estrogen dominant presentation.
Hmm.
If you
Yeah.
look at my DNA, I am 100% down that pathway. Now
Yeah.
I have a counterpart who's 6'1"
Hmm.
and long and lean. I mean, you can just imagine she's long and lean and just, narrow hip,
Yeah.
very different hormone patterns from a genetically designed past counterpoint. Both have periods, both had like all that stuff is normal.
Hmm.
Just where do we lean into? So when you're looking at the phenotype, which is that DNA related to the environment, related
Yeah.
to even nutrition and genetic signaling, we can see that variability, and they all add up to kind of how you present, and then it changes a little bit over lifetime.
Yeah. My sister and I are exactly the same way. People mistake us for twins because we look very similar and we both wear glasses and people use shortcuts. But I sit more on that androgen side. So I'm on that more lean side. If I go to the gym pretty quickly, I can toss on some muscle. Whereas she sits on that estrogen side and she is the gorgeous, gorgeous curves. So even though from a face perspective we look the same and we're both pretty lean, from
Mhm.
like a body perspective, night and day, because she also got some junk in her trunk and it's glorious. It's beautiful. But it's interesting to me that just that small shift
Yep.
in how the body prefers to make its hormones,
Mhm.
it will manifest that way. And you see that in men. So let's speak a little bit about to the male side. What's kind of that spectrum that you would expect to see from a male who is a little bit more estrogen leaning compared to a male who's a bit more androgen leaning?
Yeah, and my specialty is definitely women's health, but we see men, right? Because a lot of times we see the women, so we see the men.
Mhm.
My experience has been a lot of times the longer, leaner, the naturally leaner build, right,
Mhm.
is often the more testosterone dominant man,
Mhm.
right? And definitely like the narrow, even because men have a much narrower hip to weight rate. I
Yeah.
can't talk today. Hip to waist ratio,
Word.
abdominal, but what I often see is as they get older and they lose some of those androgens, the more androgen dominant man, so the more testosterone dominant man will continue to stay lean in his longer limbs, but start to gain weight around the middle if that
Mhm.
happens to be like what's going on, right?
Mhm.
But the
Mhm.
man that might have a slightly larger production of estrogen relative to this other person may have more weight gain around the hips and the thighs, just
Mhm.
bulkier build, right? So like a bulkier build. And I don't know if
Yeah.
that's what you've seen from the DNA company standpoint.
Yeah, yeah, we see that. I think we also differentiate too around how easy it is for one to put on muscle, right?
Yep.
The guy who's more
100%.
androgen forward, right? They're the one that is looking, they just look at weights and the muscles are
Yeah,
popping
they just,
out.
yeah.
Compared to the estrogen male, they have to put in that time, energy, and effort, and they don't even necessarily see the same ROI.
Yep.
Um, they're the ones a little bit more prone towards the pudge and might have to work a little bit harder towards that loss of muscle because we see, androgens play so much into metabolism, right?
Absolutely.
But
Yeah.
then on the flip of that, those estrogen men are keeping their hair, their luscious locks a lot longer compared to our more androgen folk who, like, in their early 20s, the lines are starting to recede, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, you're very, very, very much so there. That's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah,
For
yeah.
sure.
And sometimes cystic acne, right? And that actually happily transitions into the next genetic consideration that we have. So
Yeah.
so far we've talked about how much is your body making, just enough compared to, you got some extra. Santa was very generous. We talked about what type, the androgens relative to the estrogens. And the last question that we're asking, and this I think especially in air quote modern times is a very important question. How are you clearing these up? Right?
Yeah.
How are you cleaning them up? So, for everyone's awareness, hormones in the body are, I'd say, kind of two things. Number one, they're nice to have, right? When something's happening, your sex hormones are going to be one of the first systems impacted because, again, it's a privilege to be able to procreate. And if body thinks it's in danger, that's one of the first things it's going to stop investing in, right? Additional to that, they're a very strong and a very powerful messenger. And so the body is very tightly controlled around them because it doesn't want strong and powerful messages going out of control. So there's a lot of mechanisms to clean them up. So we, from a genetic perspective, look at how are you cleaning them up? Because this can really differentiate people. You might have someone, for example, who doesn't necessarily make a lot of hormone, but if they're not cleaning it up well, it's going to be sitting around a lot longer. And so they might present a little bit more strongly
Mhm.
compared to, maybe you have someone who makes a whole lot, but then they're also cleaning it up really quickly. They may not present in such a strong way that we expect them. So through our profiles, through our happily proprietary algorithms, right, we're assessing people. How much are you making? What are you making? And then what and how are you cleaning it up? And I think, we'll get into this a little bit later, but the cleanup question to me is a very interesting one because given everything that is within our food and water supply, et cetera, and given the way we live and are exposed to plastics, right? The cleanup is becoming more and more important because there's things that are not necessarily native to the body that these systems are also now having to clean up.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, that's, definitely the start of the route that I was down for my PhD dissertation is,
Hmm.
because one of the things, because I think, especially if people are on this call tonight and they're thinking, well, I want to know my genetics, right? And we have the
Yeah.
genetics that are determinate, right? And then we have the genetics that are modifiable, which is what
Hmm.
gets tested with the DNA co. But the other reality is if these genes were so negative, right? Like we're so damaging, for the most part, the constellation of genes that we're talking about that affect these pathways
Yeah.
would have bred their way out of the gene pool or altered so significantly that we wouldn't even be talking about them. Right. So I
Hmm.
think it's really important if you're new to genetics. I've been in this game for a really long time. I'm an OG. And and a lot of times people are like, oh my God, pardon me, I'm screwed. I'm screwed because I have these genes. Well, your
Mm.
ancestors had these genes for a reason. And it's because at
Mhm.
some point they really helped us.
Yeah.
What is really, really important is the epigenetic environmental things that are now messing with this that never were here. I mean, I think
Yeah.
it's really important to understand that everything on the planet was organic until
Yeah.
basically the brass and iron age, right? And even
Yeah.
then, we didn't really have that much inorganic material until World War I, right? Like everything that makes up our entire modern society is less than 250 years old, right? The toxins that we are exposed to. So our body goes, whoa, what is the pesticide, the herbicides, the plasticides, the phthalates, BPC, all that stuff? It does not know how to deal with those, but they go through the same pathways.
Yeah. 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 I love that grounding that you offered because I think I've been at this a while too. I may not be an OG,
And
but I'm
you're an
getting
OG.
there. I'm getting
Yes,
there.
you're an
I'm
OG.
getting there.
You're
I'm
a young
getting there.
OG. I got you on age.
Thank you. But I think one of the hard part to really communicate within, when you're reviewing someone's genes with someone, they focus on that which is bad, right? Humans have a negative bias. We could say 99 great things, they'll focus on that 1% that is not so great. And I think the beautiful thing, especially when we're looking at functional genes or most genes in general, very, very, very few are actually fatalistic and deterministic. Most are modified by environment. And so I think, especially when it comes to hormones, it's very powerful to know how your hormones flow, because then you can be much more targeted in the support thereof, especially if you're having a hormone struggle, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think
So,
that's why it's so empowering. I think it's vital to know that because I think,
yeah.
I think it gives people power to make better clinical decisions about their own care and their
Yeah.
ongoing care.
Yeah. And also just normalization of it too, right? I think sometimes it's really comforting to hear like, oh, this wasn't in my head, or oh, this is grounded. Here's a piece of paper that says this is why the way I am. I think there's a real beauty in that. I see that a lot of time with like either appetite or mood and behavior, but
Mhm.
sometimes also with hormones, right? With the female, with the woman who's struggling with endometriosis, and they're like, oh, I see why this part is so complex and difficult for me. And now I know where to focus. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it does make you feel like, okay, it's sort of vindication. Remember I had a, patient
Yeah.
years ago well, I mean, I get asked this periodically. Do you ever test for something and you don't find anything? And I'm like, no.
It's all
No, because we
information.
don't test for things we
Yeah.
don't think are going on. We don't just go on a weirdo fact-finding mission. But the reality is because we're looking at function, we're looking at things that are actionable, and we often find things that are where attention needs to go, but help define why you got to where you are and what is really going on. I mean, I think that's so valuable.
Yeah. 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 And I think as a clinician too, it helps target the questions you're asking and target where you're focusing. It
Yeah,
cuts out some things that you don't necessarily need to be working on or trying. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. I agree.
So I want to dig into more specifics. I want to kind of come in from the high level DNA questions into specific profiles. But before we do that, I wonder if the powers that be can bring up those poll questions because I want to know who our audience is. All right. So a glorious 86% of our audience this evening is female or woman. And so we will be speaking a lot to female hormones, but we have a strong 13% that are men. So we welcome you and we are grateful that you are here this evening and we'll make sure that you are spoken to as well. When we're asking about age demographics, a majority, more than, mon Dieu, let's see, 60 plus 20. Oh, goodness. 80% of our audience is over the age of 50. So I think a lot of our conversations this evening are going to more focus on hormonal changes, the menopause, the andropauses of the world, what happens at that point in time. But we see you, those that are under 40 or under 50, we see you, you're a strong 20%, and we're going to support you. And we'll also speak to getting to that point, getting to those spaces. Okay. The question is, have you ever done hormone testing before? Because I know this is going to come up a lot. And about 40% of our audience has had a little bit of experience, and about 30% of the audience is saying they actually do so on a regular basis, right? We have women, and this makes sense, right? There's a lot of conditions, concerns that might necessitate, monthly or possibly quarterly testing. Yeah. The last question that almost last question that we have you tried any hormonal therapy? So oftentimes this is going to be a replacement, but sometimes it might be a medication that blocks certain hormone pathways. 30% of our audience is currently using something. Let's see, 15% started, but then stopped. I'd be curious, those that stopped, the why behind that. Often Betty's already, she's intuiting. Betty can already tell you why, but we'll still give you the opportunity to give voice to what Betty already knows. Um, and then 20% of our audience has said no, but they've considered it, whereas another 35% is curious. They're like, maybe I just don't know enough about it. Um, and then we asked, what is the main reason that you're here this evening? Because we want to make sure we're speaking to you. We have a happy mixture of reasons. So number one reason, actually 35%, is curious about how DNA influences overall health. Okay, so we'll make sure we'll return to, I think we spoke to it, but we'll continue to speak to it. Another 30% is saying they struggle with symptoms like fatigue, weight gain, mood swings. Given the demographic of this group, Betty, I think you can already get into the why of that. And then the next most popular reason here is wanting to prevent hormone-related issues in the future. Yeah. Okay. So Betty, with awareness of where the majority of people in the audience are sitting, that andropause, menopause sort of space, why don't we give a little bit of breadth and definition to those both? Do you have a preference on which one you start with?
No, not really. We can go either way. We can go either way. I guess
Uh,
go ahead.
Go ahead. I was going to say ladies first, but we can
Okay.
do gentlemen first if you want.
I will do gentlemen first because I think, because we outnumber them today, we want to make sure that they're not feeling left out.
All right.
So obviously we reach puberty, right?
Mhm.
Girls often a little bit before boys, we reach puberty. That's the onset of sort of the testicular for men, ovarian hormone production, which kind of moves us towards fertility, right? And then you hit maturation in your late teens, early 20s. And
Mhm.
then and then I think it's important to understand that we have kind of, three different time periods in our life. You have kind of pre-puberty, you have the puberty and maturation and fertility zone, right? We have that. Then I would actually say four, let me put it that way. Then we have sort of that declining decade or so where things are a little, what I would like to call wonky. That's our technical term. And then we have the kind of post run, right? Where we're sort of past
Mhm.
that major hormone change. For men, I think the really big thing is men don't cliff dive, right? As women, we go through this very erratic period for many of
Mhm.
us, which is the perimenopausal transition to menopause, which I'll explain. But men actually have kind of what I like to call a slow roll downhill, right? Where it's statistically likely that a man, unless he's doing a lot of things to sort of regain or control and encourage testosterone production, it's significantly declining, almost to half of what it was by the time we're in our 40s compared to our 20s,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And then there are some stats looking at testosterone production today relative to like 30, 40 years ago. And our
Mhm.
overall human population production of testosterone is reduced. I don't know if you
Mhm.
know that, but statistically, right? So we just see
Yeah.
less, right?
Yeah. And I think it's important we give voice to some of the why behind that, but continue. I don't want to interrupt the definition.
Yeah. And so
Yeah.
and so for men, they don't necessarily have this erratic hormonal upheaval that women experience. So I think a lot of times for a lot of guys, they're like, I'm starting to feel less, like what I hear a lot from, the guys is they'll say, I feel like less me, I'm not motivated, or I
Yeah.
just don't feel like I have my edge anymore. And a lot of
Mhm.
that is really wrapped around that really powerful androgen of testosterone and how
Yeah.
it has this positive. It's important to know that testosterone is as much a brain hormone as it is a muscle metabolism, sexual function hormone.
Yeah.
And so men slowly roll downhill. And so by the time they get into the more, 60s and beyond, often it is now very low. We see more DHT production relative to testosterone. So the
Mhm.
less favorable hormone, we might see more hair loss. Um, and we also, because of the loss of testosterone, we can see bone mass loss. Men
Mhm.
start with so much more. They
Mhm.
often may not get osteoporotic at the same degree as women, although they carry that risk much later in life because of the loss of hormones and the loss of mobility and strength and things like that if they're not actively working on it. But I think it's important to know that these hormones, if they stay at a higher level, like if we were able to maintain our fertile levels, we wouldn't age, right?
Yeah.
We wouldn't
Yeah.
age the same, right? There's a reason why we wrinkle more quickly, our hair goes gray, it starts falling out, we lose muscle mass, we get the weird kind of
Yeah.
creepy skin above our kneecaps, and you're like, what's that? Right? That's the loss of hormone, right?
Yeah.
That is
Yeah.
the absolute loss of hormone. And men are luckier in that they don't have the cliff dive, but they do have a decline. And there's
Yeah.
a lot of perception that men don't, and they do.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think to kind of come back to your question around we as a species are producing less, a lot of this is a byproduct of things we do in our day-to-day life that erode away at our hormone, right? So when I think of testosterone and men say, what can I do to support it?
Yeah.
Right? The two biggest eroders, and hold me honest because you might know the statistics better, but
Yeah.
the two biggest eroders are lack of sleep,
Uh-huh.
incredible stress, poor diet, right?
Yep.
It's the foundations of life. And I think men really want a different answer. They want to know, like, you're lacking of testosterone, short of age.
Mm-hmm.
If we take age out of the question, lacking of testosterone is not a lack of an injection that you're getting.
No, no.
It's not a lack of an injection. I have seen men's testosterone numbers, like in certain instances, in extreme cases, again, almost double simply by fixing sleep.
Oh,
Not
100%.
even addressing anything else, simply fixing sleep. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
it's, yeah. And I mean, sleep will fix so many other things along the way, but simply to see a doubling in extreme cases of
Mm-hmm.
testosterone and blood work just by working on sleep. And so I think men need to hear that when we talk about this. There's a lot within their control.
Mm-hmm.
They can't control time. Maybe one day, maybe in the future, someone can pop back and tell us how to control time. But
Yeah.
until then, they can't do that. But they can control to a certain extent how much they're sleeping,
Yep.
how they're managing their stress, and what they're eating too, right? We can talk about all those foods that tend to encourage estrogen and dysregulation compared to supporting it, right?
Yeah, well, and exercise, right? Because exercise
Yeah.
both stimulates testosterone and is stimulated for muscle protein synthesis by testosterone. I've had a lot over the course of my 20-year career where I'd have a young man come in their 30s and say, my testosterone is low. And, you check it and they're working with one of our nurse practitioners. And it's like, yes, it is.
Yeah.
I'm like, all right, it's not normal for a man of your age to be 350. Like, okay. And it's true because they're not sleeping, they're not working out, they're
Yeah.
eating fast food, or they're kind of
Yeah.
haphazard about it, and they're stressed out
Yeah.
and literally go way, way up, like just doing those things. So you're right.
Yeah.
On the flip side of that, because I particularly because I'm in Dallas, we're one of the like hormone hubs, right? So at
Yeah.
one point we had a low T center on every corner. You could like throw a rock and hit a low T center, and they'd have cute little girls out front stopping guys and telling them they needed testosterone, because nobody can tell you more clinically how to take care of yourself than some hot chicks, right? And
Yeah. The message will not land the same with men often. Not
right,
always, but often.
right. But but they were everywhere. And so I would run into these men that would get on hormones, right? And they would go in, oftentimes not really getting clinically tested. Some places would test, but then they'd never test it again. And they would go in and be getting hormone shots, and they'd get heavier, they get man boobs, right?
Mm.
Nasty. Their blood pressure would shoot through the roof. Like they'd have all of these metabolic effects of taking this hormone. And here's the truth, and this is really important for men to know, and it's true for women too, but particularly men. If you don't have your metabolic health dialed in and sleeping and all that other stuff, it's going to aromatize to estrogen.
Yeah.
It's going to drive IGF-1, which is your growth hormone, and you're going to get all of these negative fat
Yeah.
storing, potentially metabolically damaging side effects.
Yeah.
It's not going to make you thin, hot, and just super muscly on its own. You have to do the work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? It makes the
And I
work
would say,
better.
and genes play into this too, right? Because when we look at pathways again, if we go back to those questions of how much are you making, what are you making, that what are you making question in particular, for
Mhm.
some men, if they're more prone to be pushing things down that estrogen pathway,
Yeah.
right? What is the base of estrogen? It is testosterone. So if you're tossing a lot of testosterone into
Mhm.
the system, what's happening is it's aromatizing, meaning testosterone becomes estrogen, which is why you get man boobs, which is why all these other things start to happen. It's because that testosterone is not going to what you think it will be going, of becoming this sex god. Instead, it is going towards, estrogen production. So genes play into that a little bit. And so I
Yeah.
think it's really important. There's some men that truly do need that replacement supplement. And it's not
100%.
to judge that. It's just to say, do it intelligently. Intelligently means knowing your genes. Intelligently means finding a good provider, not an untrained salesperson on the street.
Yeah.
And then lastly, also doing the other things, the difficult things
Mhm.
of diet, exercise, and sleep.
Yeah. Because, and you just need to look at those other hormones before you start going down that road, and you need to check those hormones.
Hmm.
Because the other thing that'll happen is often they'll go, okay, we're going to block your estrogen production, right, with an aromatase
Hmm.
inhibitor.
More
And
meds.
and then that's going to block sex hormone binding globulin, which is the taxi cab that drive these hormones around. And that's not great either. It was one thing to control it, it's another thing to suppress it. Because if you suppress a man's estrogen, even with high levels of testosterone, he will lose bone mass.
No.
And so I look at all that, and I think, and this is for all men out there, I think men get shortchanged
Yeah.
because the perception is all guys are going to want more testosterone, so we're just going to sell them testosterone. And this is a healthcare thing, right? This is a
Yeah.
healthcare thing, well managed and appropriately done. You can feel great, and it could be one of the
Yeah.
most amazing things if you need it, but it can also be
Yeah.
damaging if you don't.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. I love I think the more we think about the He Summit and think about how do we speak to male health, right? I think I was very well educated on how we as a medical profession have done women dirty and not served them properly. And I think the more and more I get into male health in particular, forming up things like the He Summit, right, which will be all men. For the men
Yep.
on the
We
call,
won't be there.
we won't be there. It's just going to be men. It's important you guys have your own space. But I think I'm becoming more educated as to how we've shortchanged men. And to your point, just assumed they're chasing sex and that's it,
Yeah,
which
it's a
is
little bit of the bro science,
inhumanizing.
right? It's the bro science. Like we need science, and we need credible science. And I would say
Yeah.
if you're hearing it on a podcast, but they can't quote where they got it from, I'd be a little concerned about maybe some of the recommendations, just because things get perpetuated inappropriately
Yeah.
sometimes. And I,
Yeah.
and I look at it from a scientist standpoint, and clinician. We've been doing this for 20 years, tens of thousands of patients. And
Yeah.
often the amount that has to be used and what has to be done is a lot less when everything else is dialed in, and people are so much healthier and so much better. And I do think we screw men over by assuming they're all gonna be like, yeah, man, just give me some testosterone, And it's not,
Yeah.
it's
And
not,
more at that, right? Like they start to
yeah,
see man boobs and they're like, I should be on even more.
it's like,
It doesn't,
no.
it doesn't work that way. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right,
So
exactly. So I hope men feel vindicated in that sometimes they're maybe being just sold to.
yeah, yeah. And I hope that men start to have those sorts of informed conversations with their doctors. Because I think you and I love having the conversation of women, this is how can you talk to your doctor about this? And I
Yeah,
think men, it's really important to have the same conversation. If you
yeah,
feel you're low in testosterone, having that conversation of, are you familiar with replacement protocols? How will you be monitoring it? How do you know what's an appropriate dose for me? Starting that advocacy for yourself so that it's not one of these kind of in and out conversations, really becoming mature about it. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And for
absolutely.
the for the women, I know that I don't know the exact statistic, but I think women, especially when a male is coupled with a woman will support and make a lot of the healthcare decisions even for the male partner. I forget the
Almost
exact
80%.
statistic. I think it's about 80%.
80, yeah.
So for the women on this call in particular, those women that are partnered with a male, here's when we say this, and perhaps as you're supporting your partner in their decision making, really encouraging that advocacy and having that informed conversation with their clinician, because it will benefit all involved if the testosterone being offered is the appropriate amount as opposed to the extreme amount.
Yeah, and I would say, anybody that might be coupled listening, like it'd be awesome if there's couples listening, or if there's one listening and they kind of want the other one to listen in. The other thing is
Yeah.
it, as somebody that, our providers are meeting with people, I meet with them. I like having both parties present when I can, right? Like there might be times of the visit
Yeah.
that they're not both there, but it's
Mhm.
always better to have two different brains, two different set of ears, and two different mouths, because
Yeah.
not all of us remember everything the same. And a lot of
Yeah.
times when we're trying to implement things, it's a joint effort. And so it generally helps when both are kind of on board. So if you're
Yeah.
partnered in any way, it's always good to have your partner there if they're along the road, right?
Yeah, I was very fortunate before I came to the DNA company as kind of my primary focus in practice. I had an integrative practice, and it was in a space of Toronto where people, kind of had the time and the money and the luxury to enable kind of that joint healthcare, and I saw the best outcomes there, right?
Oh,
Insofar as both partners held one another accountable, and I think, community is one of the outcomes of a medical plan, right? Do you have community support? So when the couple comes in together to do it, I
yeah.
love that you brought that up because I think it's really important as we transition into the female side of this, exactly. But men being aware of what their partner is going through, should they be partnered with a woman, so that they can also support this, in particular, some of the symptom management and monitoring.
Yeah, yeah. So women, I don't know. It's funny because it's like, why did I dedicate most of my research and multiple times in the university system, to women's health? Because I wanted more student loans. That's why. But it really came down
Delightful.
to delightful that women, because of our hormones, right, and truly, honestly, the ability to bear children, right. That's essentially
Mhm.
what it is we have such a unique body compared to a man,
Mm.
because there's so many there's
Yeah.
so many differences to how we operate because of that. So obviously, like when we're young, we hit puberty earlier,
Hmm.
which means we have the capacity to bear children earlier. And and
Hmm.
and and back in the day, 200 years ago, that was really important because our
Yeah.
lifespan was like 40. So you better knock out those kids early, because more than three-quarters of them probably weren't going to make it, or at least half. So you had to be able to have a lot. I know it's so sad, had to have a lot of children, and you needed to have them young, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
girls hit maturation very early. Just because they can reproduce does not mean they're adult mature, right? If we look at the brain development of both young men and young women, they don't really mature completely until their early 20s, women a little bit before men,
Yeah.
but we physically can have children.
Yeah.
And then when we hit that fertility time period, that kind of sexual maturation in really our late teens, but early 20s, what's interesting is young girls will often have very tumultuous periods when it first starts. They're painful, they're heavy, it's like a war, right? Because the hormones are turning on and they don't turn on right.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like a gas stove where the lighter doesn't work quite right. It's just all over the place, right?
Well, it's the first go at it all, right?
Yeah, it's the
Body's
first
still figuring
go, and
it out.
everything's sort of trying to figure out its vibe. Some of us get through that and it starts to normalize, right? Most
Hmm.
women, it starts to normalize into a cycle that's somewhere between 26 and 32 days on average, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And then we have some women that sail through each month and they are relatively non-symptomatic, like just like they
Hmm.
might have a period. We all do, but
Yeah.
there's nothing that goes along with it. But a lot of
Yeah.
women experience all the negative side effects of those hormones altering, particularly in the last half of their cycle after they ovulate,
Yeah.
which is the time when we see PMS and the mood swings and
Yeah.
the heavy periods and the fatigue and all of that. And then, as we start to go into this transitional phase where fertility becomes more questionable, and there's
Hmm.
multiple things that happen, but a lot of it is because we become anovulatory. So we're not always shooting an egg out of the egg crate. If you think of your
Hmm.
ovaries as an egg crate, we have eggs and they pop out and they make their way through the fallopian tube. But we have changing hormone levels due to
Hmm.
that, and we aren't necessarily always producing progesterone. So that's where we start to see that kind of big transitional symptom period, right?
Yeah.
So for women, perimenopause is when the symptoms are there, right? An average of 8 years, some women,
Mm-hmm.
some
Yep.
women 15, right?
Yep.
And then when we go through that perimenopausal season, the official day of menopause is 1 year from your last true cycle, but you are always in menopause. So postmenopause and menopause are the same thing, right? You are no longer making estrogen and progesterone because the egg carton is empty, right? Ovarian failure is essentially what it is. And at that point, aging acceleration happens. Now, unlike men, we don't roll downhill. Kind of we do some bungee jumping for a while, and then we cliff dive one day. So that's why
Yeah.
we are so very variable in all of our symptoms, whether it's hot flashes, night sweats, fatigue, frozen shoulder, genital urinary symptoms, musculoskeletal pain. There's so many itchy ears.
Yeah.
There's so many symptoms.
Yeah.
But we forget that testosterone is really important to women, and testosterone declines, and it declines slowly for women, kind of like men. But
Mm-hmm.
by the time we hit just that early perimenopausal stage, usually our testosterone is already low,
Yeah.
right? And
Honestly,
so
that's the one.
yeah, and so women need that as well.
Yeah.
And then in menopause, we see the acceleration of aging because women are
Yeah.
basically protected until they hit menopause from diseases of aging.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to, I think that's an important point to hit on, but I also want to make sure we're very clear about this too, because I think there's a misconception, in particular in the West, because of most people's experience, that perimenopause and menopause, that this transition is inevitably and required to be turbulent and uncomfortable and symptomatic. I think it's really, really, really important for people on on this webinar to understand that that is not necessarily the case. There are people where this just happens all of a sudden. They're like, oh, I no longer have a period. Okay, cool. And I
Yeah,
think we saw this in particular. This was really studied and popularized in the
yeah,
70s, 80s, 90s when Western scientists and North American scientists went over to certain Asian countries and said, like, oh, they don't really have a concept of menopause like we do, in the sense of that there's symptoms and it's turbulent and violent, right? And these women would go through and it would be majority, not all, but a majority would say like, oh, just one day I didn't have my period. Okay, I just kept moving. A few things changed, but that was about it. And it's important to know that this is starting to change. And the reason this is starting to change, a lot of those countries have adopted more and more Western lifestyles,
yeah,
right? So just like we were talking about with men, where we were saying poor sleep, poor diet, poor exercise, stress kind of will chop away at that testosterone in ways that it needn't. For women as well,
yeah,
this is also the case. So there's an element of, no one chooses to have menopause symptoms. Let's be very plain about that. But
yeah.
there's an element of certain lifestyle habits, certain diet
Make it worse.
habits will play into it. And especially if you have certain profiles, accentuate something that can be very tumultuous, right? We know that profiles, for those that make more than enough, dominant profiles, the way we put it in the 360, they have little bit more likelihood to being subject to this violence, to this turbulence, but it's not inevitable. And I think
Right.
that's really important for people to hear. Your body is not necessarily designed to have a turbulent menopause. We just currently live in a way, it's post Iron Age, we live in a way that encourages it.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Especially if you look at really, really traditional societies that have no real Western influence, they don't have the word for menopause. They
Mhm.
like, and it's because their culture reveres
Yeah,
women that get older. They don't have any of the toxins. They don't have any of the sugar in their diet. Like everything else about their world is very, very different. And so
yeah,
they just don't go through it in the same way. And I think that,
yeah.
when we were on the She Summit, we were talking
Mhm.
about the phytoestrogens and things like
Yep.
that. Diets that are cleaner,
Mhm.
definitely more a lot of your Asian inspired diets that might have
Mhm.
fermented soy and thing like that have more
Yeah,
phytoestrogens in it. But I would say generally a cleaner, more whole foods
yeah,
based diet's going to have more too. And so you've got
yeah.
some foods that maybe kind of indirectly supporting estrogen from a plant-based standpoint. Not enough to
Yeah.
reduce them, but definitely enough to make the transition easier,
Yeah, to
you know.
smooth things out. Because I think back in the day, like when those studies were coming out, there was always this question of maybe it's a population thing. Maybe there's this gene that means they just don't have it.
We
And to date,
find
maybe
out.
we'll find it tomorrow, but as of today, we haven't found that gene that really explains it. It's very much a diet and lifestyle sort of thing. Yeah. So I want to pull back another comment that you made, Betty. So you made the comment of once the woman hits menopause, all this protection, so because we always say, like, up until menopause, women are by and large a lot more protected from heart attack, stroke, kind of cardiovascular, and to a certain extent, diabetes. But
Mhm.
then menopause happens and all she crumbles. So do you want to speak a little bit to that? Because I think, especially given the age demographic of our audience, it's important they hear this, especially as they're considering how do they support their hormonal health to the end of really good health.
Yeah. And I think this is where, everybody goes, why'd you get on your soapbox? So I'm 55, so I'm knee deep in this arena, right? And to me, the idea of safe and protected and appropriate hormone replacement and really getting this message out and actually committing to doing this over the next 2 decades of my life was really around not so much that I felt women were shortchanged just because we were getting hot flashes and night sweats. Yeah, they suck. I'm going to be real honest. They're not fun. But that in itself, yes, they actually are indicative of a greater risk for heart attack and stroke, honestly. But it's not because the symptoms blow, right? It was because I started to become very, very hyper aware of the autoimmune history that has to do with women and their hormones, the increased risk for all-cause mortality, and particularly chronic disease that leads to a crappier lifespan, right?
Mm.
And that's what I was fascinated with. And so the reality is when women go through menopause, we basically accelerate and starts to age match men. So men usually start to have like arterial plaquing, right? So
Mhm.
atherosclerosis and arterial plaquing, they start that in their 40s. Women generally don't do that until menopause, but we accelerate and jump on the
We
gas.
catch up.
We catch up,
We catch
right?
up, is it within 5 or 10 years? I forget the exact
It's
number.
it's like 5 and some change, right? So
Yeah.
we accelerate that inflammatory response because of loss of estrogen. So estrogen
Yeah.
is anti-inflammatory, it's immune modulating, it's metabolic, it's acts as an antioxidant, it's protective to the brain. So every single part of our body is affected by the loss of that hormone, and I would argue testosterone as well and progesterone. And so what we find now is women do live longer than men. On average, it's about 4.5 years in the United States. I think Canada's right along with that number.
Mhm.
But the reality is our health span. So we live longer, but it's crappier, right? We're more likely
Mhm.
to be institutionalized in a nursing home or assisted living. We are more likely to fall and break something and end up immobilized by that. And
Mhm.
so that we sort of pay the price of having this longevity, but our health is poorer. And
Yeah, and dementia too, right? Like from a
oh,
cognitive
sure.
perspective, it's not like we're living kind of an incapacitated life, but we still have a brain that's happy. Our
Yeah.
brains also aren't happy.
No,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like 3 to 4, 3 out of 4, 3 out of 4,
Yeah.
in a nursing home are women with Alzheimer's or some form of like vascular dementia or dementia. And I mean, I can tell you from my own clinical experience, that's what terrorizes women, right? They're like, number one, I don't want to fall and have a break and end up wheelchair bound where I'm not able to be mobile.
Yeah.
I am terrified of being here physically but not here mentally,
Yeah.
and the decline and also what it does to my families. Yeah, it's just
Yeah.
I witness it because my mom's in a nursing home,
Yeah.
and so I look at that and I go, okay, what can we do as women? So let's say we're already dialing in. So here's 100% the truth. You must start taking care of the diet. You must start
Mm.
moving, and you must start lifting weights, and you must dial in the sleep, right? Like
Mhm.
you can't shortchange those. Those
Yeah.
those are like your core tenets. And we don't have to be perfect at those. We just take one step every day. We get a little better. We get a little better. We get a little better.
Mhm.
But the reality is, all the research, particularly the last few years of studies that have come out, is if women will replace those hormones at therapeutic levels, and I'll qualify those at therapeutic
Mhm.
levels, what it does is stave off that acceleration And to some degree, we might see some improvement even if you're further out. We just don't have good data for like, have you not done anything for 10 years or 15 and now
Yeah.
we're looking in. But we do have long-term user data well into our 60s and 70s. And we have these really good studies that show, hey, all causes of death go down, including all forms of common cancer, heart attack, stroke, CHF, dementia, 34% reduced risk. Who wouldn't
Yeah.
want that? Like,
That's
who wouldn't
huge.
want
That's
that?
huge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think women understanding that we've been sold a bill of goods, I will call it a lie, based on the Women's Health Initiative, that
Yeah.
we've told our hormones are deadly. And there's nothing farther from the truth. That is from a patriarchal medical sort of environment that is still not corrected, and that women
Mhm.
can protectively and healthfully do hormone replacement and protect their longevity and their health.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would offer I think I'm paraphrasing you,
Mhm.
but when you think about the fact that we now have capacity to be living into the 80s, 90s, 100s, it is the hormone replacement that is going to increase the health span so that we're enjoying that time as opposed to just living through that time.
Yeah, I think it's a really good example. How many people saw the Jane Fonda award speech from the SAG Awards? I don't
I
know if everybody
haven't,
saw. So she
I
just
haven't,
recently won a Lifetime Award.
yeah.
Okay, Jane Fonda is like
Oh,
86, 87 years old.
girlfriend's amazing.
Right? Okay, now she is a Hollywood star. Does she eat like does she eat better than most people?
She does all the things and she has great
She's
genetics because she
she
comes from a
she
lineage of actors, right?
right. She's lineage of actors. So yes, she's got some good genes on that side. And yes, she's been afforded an environment that, probably has better quality things. Yes, she's had a facelift. I think she agreed that she had that done.
Kissed by
But
the
there's
gods.
no facelift on the planet that can make you look like that at 87 years old. That is hormone replacement. That is a healthy lifestyle, right? I don't know if
Yeah.
she's doing
Yeah.
hormones, but there's no question in my mind she is, right? I don't know her
Yeah.
personally.
Yeah, no,
I would
and that
pretend.
shouldn't be something that is, I would offer shamed. I would say, and this is, I think, the destigmatizing conversation that we need to have. That was
Mhm.
a medical decision of how do I stay healthy and happy
Yeah.
throughout my years. This is not it for some, it might be vanity, and if it is great, cool, good for you, chase that vanity. But for others, we can't assume that. We can assume, though, it's to stave off heart attack, it's to preserve the mind. There are things that hormones contribute to. They contribute to the way you live. We need to
Yeah.
strip the stigma from it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think so. The other thing I want to explain is what is a therapeutic level of hormone replacement, right? Because we get told
Hmm.
all kinds of farces. Oh, they're giving really high levels and all this stuff. That is not true, right? So to give some statistics, right? So when you are ovulating, so once a month, every month of your life in most cases for a good 30, 40 years, depending on how old you are, right? You ovulated and your estrogen levels climbed to somewhere around 500 at that time,
Hmm.
month in, month out. Then it goes down a little bit, and then you get into the second half of your cycle, which is about 10 days, where it will average somewhere between 200 to 400, right? So
Hmm.
we're talking a pretty sizable peak every month, right? Month in, month out. When you're pregnant, your estrogen will go to 4,300 during the first trimester alone. So really high. The earlier you have your period, the more frequent you have your period as far as like number of years, so length of menstrual
Hmm.
cycle activity, and the more babies you have are protective to you for all forms of
Hmm.
cancer that are estrogen sensitive. It
Hmm.
is not your estrogen that causes breast cancer. Full stop. Right? That is not logical. If all of those things are protective, then is not logical to tell you that your estrogen causes your own cancer. When we replace estrogen to protect the brain, the heart, the bones, we're shooting for a blood level around 50 to 80,
Hmm.
right?
So we're talking
10,
ovulation peak around 500, 4 to 500, and you're talking replacement levels are what again?
10%, 50,
There we
50,
go.
50. We're talking 10% On
Yeah.
average, we're not looking at these very high levels, but those are the levels that we see. Hey, the brain is being protected. The bones are being
Hmm.
protected. We're not losing metabolic health. I remember seeing in the quiz or the poll, a lot of women were like, I'm having mood swings. I'm gaining weight. I'm
Yeah.
fatigued. Estrogen is a metabolic hormone, right? When we put that
Yeah.
estrogen back in, our metabolism actually works better.
Yeah.
So it's not a weight loss thing in itself, but it absolutely affects whether you gain weight or not. The average woman gains 15 to 20 pounds, 15% of their body fat. So depending on the woman, that's usually 15, 20 right out of the gate, doing the same
And
thing they were doing the day before.
the body, I think women need to know their body's always conspiring to do good by them, right? A
Yeah.
lot of that weight gain is to the end of fat is not an inactive tissue. Fat
Right.
is a metabolically active tissue. What do I mean by that? It produces a lot of different things, but it also produces estrogen. It's one of the body's ways of being like, I have just lost all my estrogen. How do I get it back? I
Make
can't
more.
call in my ovaries. They've retired. They've gone to bed. Good for them. We're going to support that. But what we will support is by putting on some extra fat, which will offer us the estrogen to the end of cognitive protection, heart protection, bone protection, right? Body conspires. And so when you support the body with those hormones, it's like, cool, I don't need this anymore. And
Yeah.
naturally, it's going to be not all of it, but a good chunk of it is like you still change metabolically over time, but some of that is going to come off, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Even your microbiome radically changes. It is very different
Yes.
where it is when we're little, when we're at sexual maturation, perimenopause and
Mm,
menopause. It's significant. Your microbiome shifts to prefer bacteria that affect your body's ability to recirculate the estrogens that went through your genetic detox
mhm.
pathways to go out through the stool to recirculate what it can get and put it back into circulation because estrogen is that important to the body. So the reality is as women, hormone replacement can absolutely be done in a very protective, safe way. Does every woman need it? No, no, not at all. I think every woman deserves the right to talk about it. My job as a PhD is
Yes.
to go through the research and help you understand it so you can make that educated decision and help practitioners understand what the
Yeah.
research says so they can put it into the market. But the other really valuable thing is when you have your DNA and you have tests that can look about at how your body actually moves your estrogens through that, we can
Yeah.
manipulate it, right? We can
Yeah.
make it all better.
Yeah.
And I think for women, it's just you have to have that practitioner that really can work with you, that has the same ethos and understanding, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not one size fits all.
Yeah. Yeah. I think my hope and our hope as a company, and Betty, you're a friend of the company, the hope is that these webinars don't tell you what to do. They instead tell you what options you have so that you can start those conversations with your provider, be it us, be it another provider, and then figure out what is best for you. Because I couldn't tell you that. Betty would never tell you that. But we will tell you what is at the buffet and what you can pick from the buffet. Yeah. Yeah.
I talk about this book every time I'm on, but it's because I think it's so very important. It's Estrogen Matters by Avram Blumel
Mm,
and Carol
mhm.
Tavris. It should
Yeah.
be Tavris, not Tavris, but it's absolutely it's scientific. So if you don't like reading it, just listen to it in your car or whatever. But it'll walk you through all of the sort of
Yeah.
history of what I just ran through, so you can understand.
Yeah. Thank you. I love that. I love that because I know within our audience there's a large contingent that wears glasses. And for those that decide to catch it on replay, we got Betty into glasses at the She Summit. She was part of the nerd squad. We're very happy about it.
Yeah, I just don't
All
have to.
right.
I don't have to wear them to see my screen, so I tend to not do that until I start blue blocking, which I probably do now.
I will always accept new members. Why don't we, I think this is a good point where we start jumping into some of the questions because I'm seeing the questions light up as we're talking through this. Um, Rachel's asking if we should check you out. I'm in favor of it, but no, she's saying she has to put on her glasses. All
Yeah, I
right.
was looking for I have two. I have some that are to read really small writing on supplement bottles, and then the other ones that are my blue blocking. So
Yeah. Yeah, there we go. Or you can just wear them all the time. Shortcuts
I
everything for you.
know.
All right. Okay, so Jenny is asking, and I'm gonna read this out because I think there's some nuance and complexity to this question. Jenny's saying, if someone has ovaries removed due to a hormone positive breast cancer, which is in certain cases pretty typical, Other than the dramatic drop in hormones, what should be expected or considered as far as supplements to support the body? What level of hormone would you expect to be made in other parts of the body, fat cells, endocrines, etc.? So before Betty jumps into this, because I know she has some thoughts, Jenny, just remember that we don't know your very complex case history, so we're going to be offering a little bit of general advice here. So make sure any thoughts that we're offering you bring back to your care provider because they would know the specifics of the cancer. And so some of those specifics might disallow what we're thinking.
Yeah. So I think I think that's why. So the book, So Estrogen Matters, I highly recommend you read it. His wife was a breast cancer patient. He is an
Mhm.
oncologist. He spent 50 years doing this.
Yeah.
And he goes through a lot of the research because, so just to break some of this to you, so different cancers are stimulated by estrogens, right? But estrogens are not just your estrogens. It could be the pesticides, herbicides, plasticizers, and other things that are exposing your body. Other cancers actually diminish when exposed to estrogen. For example, tamoxifen is a synthetic estrogen drug. I need that to sink in. It is a synthetic estrogen drug that occupies that receptor so nothing else can sit in it. So I think it's really important to talk to your doctor about your specific cancer and the long-term concerns about whether it could come back as a breast cancer or something like that. Obviously, they remove the ovaries to be sort of, preemptive, right? Um, but having had a cancer history does not mean you cannot consider estrogen replacement at some time, right? I think every person's different, and it's really important to talk to your oncologist and talk to him
Mhm.
specifically about your cancer. And we're getting better and better about cancer treatment where we actually can do
Yeah.
tumor genetics, like what is this tumor's
Yes.
certain behavior and what its
Yeah.
metastatic potential is, and what they're like, what its behavior is going to be like.
Yeah.
And I think all
Yeah.
of those things can help you understand that. I mean, we have in our telemedicine group and in our clinic, we have some people that are post breast cancer that are on hormone replacement.
It's, and I think oncologists and other professions, as we're starting to get more data, are more and more open to it. And
Yep.
part of the reason is I think more and more people, and this is beautiful, more and more people are surviving cancer. And the struggle with that is that we're getting more and more data that while it may not be the cancer necessarily that is killing people, it's actually the after effects of treatment. So they go through chemo, radiation, et cetera, which is a huge toll in the body. And then, in that 8-year period, there might be a heart attack or a stroke that otherwise would have not been there. And so we're grateful to that heart attack or stroke because, they lived long enough to have it, but it is to an extent a byproduct of the medication they were on. So I think having a conversation with the oncologist that says, like, hey, I did all these things, happy to have done them to survive, but now I need to think about how do I support my cardiovascular health? How do I recover from these incredible things I had to do to my body? And sometimes, especially now as we're getting more and more data, sometimes estrogen can be part of that conversation. And I think it's an important one given the cardioprotective benefits it has, given kind of the bone and the insulin support that it has. It's part of that aftercare conversation that needs to be part of the cancer conversation now that more and more people are surviving.
Right. And I really think it's important. Like, we are terrified as women of breast cancer, right?
Yes.
It is the poster child of cancer. It gets a lot of money for research for treatment. Like, they
Mhm.
talk about cure. None of them are looking for cures. I hate to break it to you. I've sat through some of those committee meetings, like, just because they're funding drug therapy, right? They're funding drug
Yeah.
therapy. Drug therapy is used after it's found, not once
Yeah.
it's, not avoiding it, right? There are other people trying to help make that not happen, but most of the funding isn't going there. But the reality is, and again, this is I'm not an either or person. I'm not conventional care none or integrative alternative only. But the reality is 95% of all breast cancers, if caught early, are 100% treatable, curable with the current treatment that we use, whether it's archaic or not, or just brutal.
Mhm.
The reality is we've gotten very good at it, right? Because so much money has gotten to it. But we're starting to recognize that there's other things that can be done that can be really, really protective. That's why I think it's so important to understand our genetics about how we package estrogens. Personally, this is now my personal opinion. I have plenty of hypotheses that are working hypotheses, but I think what we are going to find in the decades to come is that the increased risk of breast cancer that we see in women postmenopausally, and the risk of certain women that are younger, because again, the average age is 62, ladies. It is not something that a 40-year-old gets. It's when we have been menopausal for a long time. We have no estrogen. I believe the secret is in these genetic pathways and all the crap that's going through here in our body's ability to get rid of it. Right. I think we're going to find a lot there that we'll be able to manipulate. We just don't have the data. It's not sexy to the pharmaceutical companies to look at. They can't make a drug for it.
Yeah. Yeah. Which I think also speaks to the uptick that we've been seeing over the past decade of cancer
Oh,
rates,
yeah.
in particular in younger populations where traditionally we wouldn't be expecting cancers, right? For a long time, we thought cancer was this ailment of, oh, look, we've advanced so that we're living longer and cancer is inevitable. But now we're starting to see it creep down into anyone under 50 is kind of considered a really young cancer case, right? And
Yep.
we're starting to see it creep down, not even in the 50, like in the 40s, we're seeing it in the 30s.
Yeah.
And that's where the concern.
And
Okay.
it's not just, that's all cancers, all form of cancers. So we're
Yeah.
seeing sort of new young penetration.
Okay. All right. Anne has our next question.
Okay.
Anne is asking, how do I know for certain if she's in menopause? What markers is she looking for on blood work? Um, She's also estrogen dominant from her DNA report. So for those that are interested, that means, the question of what type of hormone is she making? Her body favors estrogen, and dominant meaning she makes more than enough. So she's estrogen dominant. And so want to know how kind of just to support aging gracefully in light of she's in-ish menopause, maybe not biochemically confirmed, but sounds like she's asking the question, she's very close to it, right?
Yeah.
And asking how do we support age-full gracing, especially if she has an estrogen dominant profile, which we know can have a little bit more of a turbulent
Yeah.
experience in menopause and much more of a dramatic drop in hormone available to the person.
Yeah. Yeah. So technically, if you're still cycling, right? If you're having a cycle, you're in the transitional phase, right? You can have very low estrogen and still have a cycle. I just have to break it to you. That was news to me. I was like, oh, I didn't realize that,
No.
but so it could be relatively low and you could still be cycling, right? It's just right. But if you're still cycling, you're not technically in menopause. Menopause is one full day from the last period you had, right? Now, if you've had an ablation or something like that, then we have to kind of get crafty on trying to test for it, right? If you have some sort of surgical intervention that would preclude us from being able to understand that. There is a way to test and judge whether you're kind of in the throes of it. And it's you do your follicular stimulating hormone in the first 5 to 7 days or after you start your period, right? Or where we think that is. Again, if you're not cycling, sometimes we're kind of throwing a dart until we get there. We have to sort of extrapolate that understanding, but that's the technical time. And I would say if we look at the data from the research and you're considering hormone replacement, starting before you're in that transition or while you're in the transition has shown to be the most protective because you basically stave off some of that acceleration of aging as it gets started. Right. But even if you're a couple years out, or even if you're 10 years out, it's still part of the conversation. But we know we get like the best effect if we get it started as you're going through.
Yeah, perfect. Love it. You feel good with that answer?
Yeah.
Okay, sweet. All right, so I have two different questions from Rob. Welcome to the mail. Hi, Rob. So his first question is for estrogen dominant males. Again, so Rob's body will favor, relatively speaking, more estrogen relative and more than enough when it comes to that. What are some factors that could be going towards hair loss? Because I did make the comment that typically, phenotypically, we'd expect it more the androgen profiles. And then his other question is, can you talk about codominance in females? That's a profile. So I'll take this question in a second.
Yeah.
The good, the bad, and the ugly, especially when it comes to training. It sounds like a lot of exercise and nutrition training.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to tackle the bald question or shall I?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this because I definitely have some thoughts, but because you guys have looked at so many people's data on DHT
Yeah.
production relative to codominance, because I think you could probably have both, right?
Yeah, so Rob, I think there'd be an element of we'd want to look into your profile because you remember how I said there's this question of how do you clean things up? So estrogen dominant really speaks to a lot of that production side. I'd be really curious within your profile how quickly you are or not cleaning up your testosterones, right? Are you favoring to be creating a lot of the DHT? Are you not cleaning that up? And that can become very problematic. outside of that, sometimes hair loss can be for nutritional reasons. Sometimes it's for different genetic reasons that we're just, are either not considered. They're a bit more specific to hair as opposed to, um, to sex steroid hormone pathways. It can also very much be a byproduct of certain medication or certain medical conditions. So there's a lot of things, that confound why one might be losing hair. I think there's also a question of what is the pattern? Are we talking male pattern baldness, or are we talking a general loss?
Yeah,
So I think,
cortisol will do that. Like cortisol, and COVID did
Mhm.
it, right? So mitochondrial damage, things like that. But
Yeah,
cortisol will cause kind of diffuse hair loss where you just kind of lose a little bit everywhere.
yeah, yeah, or nutritional deficiencies, or thyroid, or. Yeah,
Yeah.
so I think, if you're really looking to dig into that question, you might want to shoot us a note and we can maybe set up some time to look over your profile. And
Yeah.
so the other question, asking about codominance in females. So let me explain this profile and why in both men and women, it's one of the most dubious profile, like tricky to understand profiles. So it's a profile called codominance, co meaning both androgens and estrogens. Okay. So what this is saying is this person has pathways that favor both productions in a very happy, more than enough sort of way. Meaning, in the female, she's making a lot of estrogens and she's making a lot of androgens. And so, what will this female look like? It's it can be, if managed properly, the best of both worlds, meaning there's those estrogens to really afford that soft femininity and the cardiovascular and the bone protection that estrogen affords. Additional to that, those androgens really enable a bit more of a higher metabolism, lean physique, ability to put on muscle. So it's kind of the best of both worlds in that you have a theme, a leaner, more muscle forward female, but still with some curves. Now, this is why I call it a more tricky profile, is that there's also more opportunity for things to go awry. This person typically tends to have much more fraught periods. They tend to have, a little bit more fraught from a skin perspective, a little bit more tricky from a skin perspective. And they're also a lot more sensitive to their environment. What do I mean by this? If there's things that might, so if you're eating a really poor diet, it can shift you a little bit more into an androgen dominant space or an estrogen dominant space, depending on what you're eating. You can kind of be one of those people that can teeter totter to both sides. And when you're trying to treat, if someone comes in and they need treatment, right, and you try to work on the estrogen and bring it down a little bit, that can then spur the androgen side. So it's not to say it's a horrible profile. It's kind of the best of both worlds, but it's something that clinically speaking needs a lot more attention and clinic, like when things aren't working, and the plan that you would be undertaking to support it needs to be very slow and gentle, because you don't want to flip from one side to the other. So I hope that was helpful. When it comes to nutrition, et cetera, I think there's a lot more to be considered there. And so perhaps connecting with us just so that we can dive into what exactly that question is and what exactly is that profile, because that's a big complex question there. Yeah. Betty, any thoughts before I move on to our next
Yeah,
question?
I would say I would agree with everything that you said. They do have the best of both worlds. They're not like so
Yeah.
estrogen dominant that it's harder for them to lean out,
Hmm.
So some of those things, but on the other side, yes, you know, yeah. So I'd say
Yeah.
looking at
Yeah. 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 All right. I am going to move on to the next question we have here. So Janice, hi Janice, we see you here often. Um, what is your feeling on hormone replacement therapy in women with a history of PE? So I would imagine that's pulmonary embolisms.
Hmm?
So yeah, I know. I already, Betty, run with it because I know you have opinions and feelings.
Yeah, well, I'm going to give you opinions and feelings, but I'm actually give you some of the science. So P's, obviously pulmonary embolism, that can be like little clots and things like that. Often individuals with that have some genetic risks for clotting. Not always, but they could have MTHFR, factor five, other things, or they could have had, something that happened from a surgical intervention, right? So there's multiple ways we could have this occur. What's interesting is there was a 10 million woman study that came out this last summer. And this was one of the first very large scale studies where we compared women who were, so these are all women over 65, so significantly past menopause, And they looked at two groups that were on hormones and stayed on them and never stopped, and then women who didn't do it at all. And then they did a group that did it for like hot flashes and got rid of it. The women that were on hormones, basically all cause mortality got better, right? So basically hormones were shown to protect you against all causes of dying, even PEs. What was even more important, so this was the first time that we were able to distinguish hormone replacement with estrogen orally in the form of Premarin and topical preparations. Premarin, and specifically Prem Pro, which is the synthetic progestin medroxyprogesterone, have clotting risks in all people, but especially those that might carry some additional risks, which would then increase your risk for PEs and or strokes or DVTs or those kind of things. What was interesting, and it was so statistically significant that it was actually made the abstract, right? So it made it into the 350 word, is for the first time they showed if you use topical bioidentical estrogen, oral progesterone, and they didn't look at testosterone particularly because it's not FDA approved other than for sexual dysfunction. But if you use topical estrogen, all risks for clotting disorders goes away when you take it away from liver detoxification, right? Again, because what happens with oral Premarin, it's 13 different estrogens. It goes down to the liver first, moves through the genetic pathways of your detox pathways, right? So some good, some not so good, right? And then it hits your bloodstream. When you do topical estradiol, it doesn't go through the liver at all. It hits your bloodstream, it gets utilized. What's left over then goes to the liver and then gets detoxified. And it's the same one, only one that you make. So somebody that has a risk of PE, that would show that topical estrogen, oral progesterone is mitigating that risk that we would have normally seen with the orals, right? And I think that was like 10 million women. Okay, I feel pretty good about that stat, right? Your doctor may not have read it. If they haven't, you want to look up the study and just say safety of hormone replacement over 65, print that sucker, circle it, and take it to your doctor, because it's not the same, if you're using topical.
Yeah. So for the non-nerds out there, when she's talking about the abstract, kind of think about this, the clickbait headline. The fact that this sentence made it into their clickbait headline was pretty huge. Scientists are not.
No, we're not.
There's a lot of traits that can be ascribed to us. We're very careful what we state, though. And so this is a huge statement. This was like saying, like, click me. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. We are the ones that are like, maybe, indicate. We're really
we're not sure, but maybe.
Yeah, this
Cross our fingers.
Yeah, we
this
are
is huge.
It
is huge for a scientist to do humble brag within their abstract.
Right, huge.
All right. And Janice, I see another question here that's very specific as to, are we able to support with some of that blood work? And the answer is yes. Just get in touch with us, and we can put you in touch with one of our clinicians in particular that focus on hormones. And the answer is yes. There's actually a gene that we're going to be bringing out soon that can speak specifically to what you're talking about. All right, Vicky. Vicky is saying she's on BHRT and progesterone capsules, and they've helped her sleep, but she feels like she's developed a tolerance over time and they don't work as well. Is that normal?
Well, so what I would say, progesterone's mechanism is that it helps the GABA receptor, which GABA is your neurotransmitter. Think of that as kind of your natural Xanax. GABA is what helps us stay asleep. Progesterone holds the receptor so the keyhole opens so GABA works better. So often when women get progesterone in there for the first time, when it's been declining in their 40s, they're like, oh my God, I'm sleeping. Now, if you're only on progesterone orally, right, you probably got the first leg up on sleep and it improved it. But without estradiol, you may not be protecting the other side of sleep. Estradiol has a positive effect not only on the thermostat, but some of the mechanisms of sleep also. So if you're on progesterone alone, it may not be enough, right? You might actually need the counterbalance of estrogen, right? Even if you're cycling, you might be on the decline at this point. You need somebody that knows how to manage that. Or you may need a slightly higher dose. The dose range for most women is going to usually between 100 to 250, 300 usually is on the high end. Most women fall in that 200 range-ish. So it may be that you're not on the right dose and you want to talk to your provider about that too. But I would say if you're on it alone, you may be missing the other side. You can't make up for estrogen leaving by just doing progesterone, right? And they don't work that way.
Love it. All right. So Miralu, I hope I'm saying that correctly. Miralu has a question. Her questions regarding both men and women. Can working out too much cause hormone imbalance? Um, yeah, I'm also going to nod. We'll give explanation, but the answer is yes. I have several clients that use working out to not have to deal with other issues that they have to face. Also, yes. And so, if so, which hormone is being tanked by working out too hard? So, yes, all of them. No.
Yes,
Uh,
yes, yes.
I have a funny anecdote. I have a girlfriend, and she's also a naturopath, and she's very athletically inclined, and so she went into kind of the athletic support side of it. There's huge space for naturopaths in that space. And she was so excited to be doing all this advanced sports med. And then she got deeper and deeper into it. And she's like, I'm a psychologist. And she was really angry about it because the people she would see are people who are injured. And then now that they can no longer do their sport of choice, they're now having to confront all the things that they were running away from or using their sport to escape from. So it's very, very, very common there. But I think so. Yes is the answer. Over exercise, exercise creates inflammation within the body, and within meter and measure, that's a great thing. It's often a positive inflammation. It signals the body create muscle, do these things that we want you to be doing, stay healthy, support your biome, support all of these metric. If you're overdoing it, that inflammation becomes overwhelming to the system. And if you remember at the top, I kind of said hormones to a certain extent are nice to have within the body. If the body feels too taxed, it will stop making certain luxuries, this hormone being one of them. So, how this can manifest differently, especially in women who overtrain, and we see this a lot. I think gymnasts are the most studied in this space, but other professions as well, or other athletic professions are studied. They can run the risk of losing their period because they're exercising to a point where they're not properly creating that ability to cycle through. And so they go into this amenorrheic or without period phase, right? I'm not as familiar with the male biochemistry behind overexercise, Betty. I'm not sure if you are, but I would imagine it's probably coupled to cortisol preventing
Yeah.
certain things. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So essentially, what happens, we see this in especially like long distance runners, cross country runners too.
Mhm.
We see it. There's a what they call the women's triad, which is loss of body fat to the extent that it affects hormones. So basically, they lose too much body fat. The body stops the period because it's like I'm no longer safe to procreate, right?
Mhm.
We also see bone loss, right? Loss of estrogen, bone loss, microfractures and damage. We will also see, loss of muscle mass. You see all kinds of things. So even though they're working out, they might be losing muscle mass because the body is cannibalizing muscle because they are also under eating in many cases. I came from the bodybuilding. And so all of that stress on the body, the overtraining, the
Mhm.
dieting, the whittling down, all the things that you might be doing to kind of over exercise in whatever sport you're in radically shifts you into a catabolic state of cortisol excess, which downregulates all of the controllers that tell you to make sex hormones and
Yeah.
downregulate thyroid, right? So you can cause, I think, long-term thyroid
Mhm.
dysfunction by doing these things.
Yeah.
And then they'll be like, why? And then they feel like they need to double down again and double down again, and it just gets worse, right? So
Yeah.
everything in balance. Exercise is hormetic. It's one of those things that the right amount is very, very helpful. Too much is damaging, and too little is
Yeah.
damaging.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that was a beautiful answer, right? And everyone has different thresholds, but
Mhm.
by and large, those are the trends we see.
Yeah, DNA company can help you figure out your thresholds on different type of exercise, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, absolutely. No, I won't even elaborate. Absolutely. All right. So Blake is asking a question. My DNA profile shows estrogen dominant. Are there tips of things to do to mitigate this effect? So I would imagine Blake is a male name. Blake can kind of
Mhm.
go both ways. I wasn't sure. My testosterone levels are still good, but I'm curious if the estrogen dominance affects things like fat storage and muscle development. Yes, yes. Yeah. So
Yeah.
so are there things that you can do? I'd say there's an element of we'd have to see your profile specifically, right? Because we need to understand what is creating this pathway of estrogen dominance. There's a few different points within the pathway that can create it. And so the answer to this would be specific to that. But in general, yes, there are certain supplements or lifestyle habits that you can adopt that will not encourage the incredible production or creation of estrogens, right? As well as encourage the production of testosterones. In general, one thing I really, really do encourage, though, men who have more of an estrogen dominant profile outside of diet, sleep, etc., the obvious, is really focusing on weightlifting and muscle building, right? Because within your muscles, you have androgen receptors, right? So the more muscle you have, there's an element of the more androgen receptors you have. So more places to receive that testosterone. Okay. And so that's one thing that you can control alongside ensuring you get rest so that you're supporting adequate levels of testosterone. We want to optimize both sides of the equation. How much testosterone do you have? And that is going to be through sleep, through diet, through stress, and through exercise. And on the receptor side of things, where can the testosterone go? A lot of that has to do with muscle and where you can have it received. It's received in many different places, but one of the places that you really can control how many receptors you have is going to be in muscle, right? Um, Betty, any additional thoughts? Because I would
Yeah,
imagine.
no, yeah, I would say that, yeah, without, because we can't give Blake like exact things because we don't know what his
Mm-hmm.
like what is actual DNA, each one of them. But there are a lot of things when you've dialed that other stuff in that you can sort of manipulate through supplementation and other stuff that sort of makes that pathway less amplified.
Yeah. 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 And I think it's important. We want to target it as opposed to guess and kind of give you all the things that it could be.
Yeah, because yeah,
Yeah.
it can be a laundry list, and that's really important because without your own, you need to be working with a practitioner that has all that stuff in front of you. Because things that get thrown out, I'll give an example: DIM or
Mm-hmm.
orthane or citrus bioflavonoids, hops. They all manipulate these pathways.
Mm-hmm.
It all depends what genetics show up with what epigenetics show up as to which
Yeah.
ones you need to dial in. And just because they sound good in theory, they can actually make things worse rather than better.
Yeah. 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 Totally, totally agree. Totally
Yeah.
agree. Yeah. Okay. All right. So Jan is asking a question. She was asking if we're getting to specific genes, or is this mainly an overview? So Jan, typically with hormone in particular, it tends to be an overview because we are looking at a system, and the system, I believe we consider 14 different genes. So it's really difficult to kind of put them all together because we really have to look at that pattern and that trend. So we do stick at more the profile level, but that is to the end of ease and simplicity. If you ever want to attend a biochemistry lecture with Betty and I, will totally toss on our glasses and have fun with. We can kind of do a bit more specifics. It just confuses the point kind of to jump
Yeah,
through.
yeah, it gets really,
Yeah.
we get stuck in the weeds because it's like, okay, these are the 18 to 25 different patterns that are dominantly seen, right? It gets
Yeah.
really weedy, really bad. As somebody that teaches this, like to
Yeah.
clinic, it's like, yeah, it's nasty.
And
Like,
if you're interested though, Jan, so two different avenues, because I love the armchair nerd, meaning like you're not necessarily a professional in this space, but you're so excited by it. Two different options that you have. Number one, when you do get your DNA 360, we do list and go through all these genes very specifically. But separate to that, we do have a space called DNAU, and DNAU is where we host all of our learning material. So if these specific genes really excite you and you want to sit with each gene intimately and understand what does it do? How does it act? How can you modify and manipulate that? DNAU might be your space. And so the powers that be can toss that in the chat so that you know where you can access that. Okay. All right. Linda has a question for you, Miss Betty. Um, what causes night sweats?
so what causes night sweats are, so there's a thermostat in your body. It's actually the controller of lots of things in your bodies, but in this particular place, it's called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus has estrogen receptors. So when your estrogen is all over the place, the bungee cord I was talking about in your 40s, where it's up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down, and then it just declines rapidly, it causes that thermostatic control that estrogen controls to go sideways. What the other thing is what some of the studies have shown is all of us have kind of our own thermostat sort of gauge range, right? Like mine is a pretty wide range. I have actually a relatively low body temperature, right? And so if I have a big range, my likelihood for hot flashes is lower. The person that has this really narrow definition of their own body temperature have a higher degree of this variability when it happens. But all of that, and I would say it's more common to see it in a more estrogen dominant woman or that has pathways of detoxification that are more dominant, but not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And there's a few other genes that will play into that basal metabolic rate. What Betty was saying, she kind of runs a little bit on the lower side. And then
Mhm.
I would also say there's other conditions that can play into it too. Not getting too complex, but I think it's really important to, for women in particular, step out of the box of is it hormones to what else could it be? Because I think sometimes we get a little bit reductionistic with
Yep.
women and be like,
And
it's absolutely hormone when there's a lot of other things that can raise and create some night sweats there.
yep,
Yeah.
blood sugar and cortisol too. Absolutely, which are
Yeah.
not even anything to do with your hormones. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we are getting to that time where we actually run a little bit over. And so I know there were a few more questions in the chat box because everyone's really excited, but the powers that be, we see you, we value you. The powers that be are taking those questions down and we are going to reach out to you. So if you tossed a question into the chat, I promise we're responding. Just it's not going to be at this time because both Betty and I have bedtimes. And so,
I have another
not
call in an
not
hour.
literally now,
I
but
have another
Betty and I
webinar in an hour. So.
Betty and I are crunchy enough that we're mindful. We're like, we have to turn screens off soon. So Adele, it was such a privilege and pleasure, especially after the fun of last week. And so thank you for partaking in the She Summit with me next week. And thank you for the teaser as to what is to come in the He Summit that is coming up, that we won't necessarily be delivering the content for, but I think you and I are both very passionate about because it's important that male health needs are met and they're not necessarily being well served because we just like we'll tell women, oh, it's just your hormones, don't worry. I think we tell men like, oh, don't worry, as long as you're having sex, you're fine. That's not
Right. Yeah,
fair.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. That's not fair
Whatever.
either.
We
Right.
ignore
Yeah.
female sex and push male sex. It's all the things. Yeah.
It's all the things, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
We deserve more precision. We deserve medicine 3.0 that is more personalized, right? That's what
Yeah.
science is. Medicine just needs to follow it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where your genes come in, right? They offer that gateway drug, if you will, to that personalized medicine. So, Medell, thank you so very much to those in the audience who cared to show up for themselves, for their partner, for a family member, for just their general learning for their patients. Thank you so very much. And I guess we're going to dance out of here. You know, we dance out of these things. So, we'll see everyone later. Au revoir.